The moment 10-year-old Max Williams walked onto the voice stage with his mother Sarah, something different filled the air. Not because of his appearance, though his carefully measured steps and the way he avoided eye contact with the cameras were noticeable under the bright studio lights, but because of the way he moved, the repetitive hand flapping that seemed to calm him, the quiet humming that escaped his lips even when he wasn't singing. What nobody in that studio knew was that Max experienced the world differently than most people, processing sounds, lights, and emotions through the unique lens of autism. And what was about to happen would prove that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from minds that work in ways most people never imagine. Max had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at age 3, after his parents noticed his delayed speech development and his tendency to become overwhelmed by everyday sensory experiences. Simple things like grocery store lighting or the sound of the vacuum cleaner could send him into a state of distress that would last for hours. But Sarah and her husband David had also noticed something remarkable: Max's extraordinary relationship with music. While loud noises often upset him, melodies seemed to organize his thoughts in ways that nothing else could. Rhythms helped him feel safe and grounded when the world felt chaotic, and singing gave him a way to communicate feelings and ideas that he couldn't express through regular conversation, allowing his brilliant mind to share insights that surprised and delighted everyone who took the time to really listen. "Music makes the numbers in my head quiet," Max had told his mother when she asked why he loved singing so much. It was one of the most complex sentences he had ever spoken, and it helped Sarah understand that for Max, music wasn't just entertainment or even a hobby. It was a form of therapy, a neurological organizing system, a way of making sense of a world that often felt overwhelming and chaotic. Max's relationship with music had begun when he was just 4 years old. Sarah had been playing a Beethoven symphony while doing housework, and she noticed that Max, who had been having a particularly difficult day with sensory overload, suddenly became calm and focused. He sat perfectly still for the entire 40-minute piece, his usually restless body finding peace in the mathematical precision of the composition. From that moment on, music became Max's refuge, and his way of connecting with the world around him. He learned to play piano by ear, picking out melodies that he heard once and playing them back with startling accuracy. He began humming constantly, not random sounds but complex musical phrases that seemed to help regulate his nervous system and process his environment. By age 7, Max was composing his own simple songs, melodies that captured emotions he couldn't express in words. His music teacher, Mrs. Peterson, had been the first person outside his family to recognize that Max's musical abilities weren't just impressive for a child with autism, they were impressive for any child, period. "Max hears music in ways that most people don't," Mrs. Peterson had told Sarah during a parent-teacher conference. "He understands mathematical relationships between notes, he feels emotional content in melodies that trained musicians work years to develop sensitivity to. His autism isn't limiting his musical ability, in some ways, it's enhancing it." The suggestion to audition for The Voice had come from Mrs. Peterson, who believed that Max's unique musical gifts deserved a larger platform. Sarah had been hesitant, knowing how challenging new environments could be for Max, how overwhelming crowds and unfamiliar situations could trigger anxiety that would make it difficult for him to perform. But Max himself had been excited about the possibility. "I want to share the quiet music," he had told his mother, referring to the way melodies organized his thoughts and brought him peace. "Maybe it will make other people's numbers quiet too." Standing on the Voice stage now, Max felt the familiar anxiety that came with new environments, unfamiliar people, and unexpected sensory input. The studio lights were brighter than anything he was used to, creating visual patterns that his brain couldn't help but analyze and categorize. The audience was larger than any group he had ever performed for, their collective breathing and small movements creating a complex auditory landscape that his sensitive hearing couldn't ignore. The cameras and equipment created visual complexity that made his mind race with calculations and observations. He could hear the electrical hum of the equipment, Feel the vibrations from the air conditioning system, sense the nervous energy from the production crew. All of these inputs combine to create the kind of sensory overload that, in other situations, might have caused him to shut down completely. But Max had learned coping strategies over the years, ways to manage overwhelming situations long enough to accomplish important tasks. The rocking motion helped regulate his nervous system. The hand flapping provided proprioceptive input that calmed his anxiety, and avoiding eye contact reduced the social pressure that could easily overwhelm his ability to process information. As Max began to sing Somewhere Over the Rainbow, his voice was pure and clear, carrying an emotional honesty that seemed to come from someplace deep within him. The song choice wasn't accidental. It was about hoping for a place where things would be different, where someone like him might fit in more easily, where the challenges of daily life might be transformed into something beautiful. But as he sang, he also began to display the self-soothing behaviors that helped him manage anxiety and sensory overload. He rocked back and forth in a gentle, rhythmic motion that seemed to match an internal metronome. His hands occasionally flapped at his sides, providing the physical input his nervous system needed to stay regulated. His gaze focused on a point somewhere above the audience's heads, avoiding the direct eye contact that could feel overwhelming and invasive. Blake Shelton, Kelly Clarkson, John Legend, and Niall Horan sat in their red chairs, initially focused on Max's remarkable voice, but gradually becoming aware that this young performer was experiencing the world and the performance differently than most contestants they had encountered. Max has autism, Sarah had whispered to the production team before the performance, her voice filled with both pride in her son's abilities and anxiety about how his differences might be perceived. Music helps him communicate in ways that regular conversation doesn't. Please be patient with him if his behavior seems different from what you're used to. He's not being disrespectful or difficult, he's doing his best to manage a situation that's inherently challenging for someone with his neurological differences. As Max continued singing, his rocking became more pronounced. His way of managing the overwhelming sensory experience of performing on national television in front of millions of viewers. The bright lights created visual stimulation that his brain processed more intensely than neurotypical individuals. The sounds of the audience, their breathing, small movements, whispered comments, created an auditory complexity that required significant mental energy to process and filter. Some audience members began to notice Max's movements, whispering among themselves, unsure of what they were witnessing. Some seemed curious and concerned. Others appeared confused or uncomfortable. The cameras occasionally captured audience members exchanging glances, clearly uncertain about how to interpret what they were seeing. Sarah, standing in the wings with the other family members, felt her heart break as she watched her son's natural coping mechanisms become the focus of attention, instead of his incredible musical ability. She knew that Max was doing his best to manage an environment that was inherently challenging for someone with autism, but she also knew that people who weren't familiar with autism spectrum disorders might not understand what they were seeing. When Max finished singing, the coaches began to respond to his performance, their voices filling the studio with praise and questions. But the combination of multiple people speaking at once, bright lights, and loud applause created a sensory overload that caused Max's anxiety to escalate rapidly. His rocking became more intense, his hands flapped more rapidly as he tried to process everything happening around him. The sounds seemed to echo and multiply in his sensitive auditory system, creating a cacophony that made it difficult for him to focus on any single voice or instruction. "Max," Blake called out gently, his instincts telling him that something was happening that went beyond normal stage nerves. "That was beautiful, son. How are you feeling up there?" Max couldn't make eye contact, his gaze focused on a point somewhere past the coaches as he continued his rocking motion. The question required him to process his internal state, translate it into words, and communicate it verbally, tasks that became exponentially more difficult when he was already overwhelmed by sensory input. "Numbers in my head," Max said quietly, his voice barely audible over the studio's ambient noise. Music makes them quiet, but now they're loud again. Blake felt something shift in his understanding of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just stage fright or nervousness that would pass with encouragement or reassurance. This was a young person struggling to manage a neurological condition, while trying to share his remarkable gift with the world. Blake had worked with many young performers over his years as a coach, and he had developed an intuitive sense for reading their emotional states and needs. Something about Max's behavior and his mother's anxious expression in the wings told him that conventional approaches to calming nervous performers wouldn't be appropriate or effective in this situation. Without consulting anyone, without asking permission from producers, without following any established protocol, Blake was out of his chair and walking toward the stage. He moved slowly and deliberately, understanding instinctively that sudden movements or loud voices might further overwhelm someone who was clearly struggling with sensory processing. "Max," Blake said softly as he approached, his voice calm and patient, "can I come up there with you for a minute? I'd like to understand better what you're experiencing." Max didn't respond verbally, but he didn't move away either, continuing his rocking motion as he processed Blake's presence in his peripheral awareness. Blake climbed onto the stage and instead of trying to stop Max's rocking or encourage him to make eye contact, he sat down on the floor beside him. The gesture was simple but profound. By literally getting down to Max's level, by not trying to force him to conform to expected social behaviors, Blake was communicating respect for Max's way of being in the world. "Show me how the music talks to you," Blake said gently, his voice barely above a conversational level. "I want to understand what you hear that I might be missing. Can you teach me about the numbers in your head?" For the first time since his performance began, Max glanced briefly at Blake, surprised by this adult who wasn't trying to change his behavior or make him act normal. Instead, Blake was asking to learn from him, to understand his unique perspective and experience. "The numbers," Max said, still rocking, his voice gaining slight strength, as he found someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding rather than correcting him. "They count everything: lights, sounds, people breathing, shoes tapping, heartbeat. Too many numbers make noise in my head, like static on a radio. But music makes the numbers dance together instead of fighting with each other." Blake felt tears forming in his eyes as he began to understand the complexity of Max's experience, the way his mind processed information differently, and how music served as both a refuge and a means of communication for him. The metaphor of numbers dancing versus fighting was surprisingly sophisticated and poetic, revealing an inner life that was rich and complex, despite Max's difficulty with conventional social interaction. "That's beautiful, Max," Blake said softly, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "I never thought about music that way before. Can you teach me how to make the numbers dance? Can you show me what that feels like?" Without warning, Blake began to rock gently back and forth, mimicking Max's motion. Max looked at him with surprise, then something that might have been relief. Here was an adult who wasn't trying to stop his coping mechanisms, but was instead trying to understand and even participate in them. "Like this?" Blake asked, continuing to rock in rhythm with Max. "Does this help the numbers organize themselves? Does it make the loud sounds quieter?" Max nodded, and for the first time since he'd taken the stage, he made direct eye contact with Blake. "You're making the numbers quieter too," Max said with wonder in his voice, as if he had discovered that his experience wasn't completely unique, that someone else could understand and even share his way of managing the world. The audience, initially uncertain about what they were witnessing, began to understand that they were seeing something extraordinary. An adult taking the time to meet a child where he was, to understand his unique needs, to validate his different way of experiencing the world, rather than trying to force him to conform to neurotypical expectations. Kelly Clarkson, watching from her chair, was openly crying. "Blake," she called out softly, "what you're doing right now is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen on this show. This is what compassion looks like in action." John Legend added, his voice thick with emotion, "Max, Your voice is incredible, and the way you experience music is a gift. Thank you for sharing that with us and for teaching us something new about how different minds can understand rhythm and melody." Niall, clearly moved despite his youth, said, "I'm learning so much just watching you both. This is what music is supposed to be about. Connection, understanding, making each other feel less alone in the world." Blake stood up slowly and extended his hand to Max. "Would you like to sing with me? We can rock while we sing if that helps the numbers stay quiet and organized. You can teach me how music sounds when the numbers are dancing." Max looked at Blake's hand for a long moment, processing the offer and the physical contact it would require. Touch was often challenging for him, but something about Blake's patient, non-demanding presence made the interaction feel safe rather than overwhelming. Slowly, Max reached out to take Blake's hand, finding that the human connection actually added to rather than detracted from his sense of security and regulation. Together, they began to sing "Somewhere Over the Rainbow" again. But this time, Blake's voice joined Max's, creating a harmony that seemed to emerge naturally from their shared movement and mutual understanding. Their gentle rocking created a shared rhythm that seemed to calm both of them, demonstrating how accommodating different neurological needs could enhance rather than detract from a musical experience. As they sang together, Max's anxiety visibly decreased. The overwhelming sensory experience became manageable when he had Blake beside him, when his coping mechanisms were accepted and even shared rather than discouraged, when his different way of being in the world was celebrated rather than hidden or corrected. When they finished, the applause was different from anything the voice had ever experienced. It was respectful, understanding, filled with appreciation for both Max's musical gift and Blake's compassionate response to his needs. The clapping was softer, more sustained, recognizing that they had witnessed something more meaningful than a typical performance. "Max," Blake said, still holding his hand, "you taught me something today that I'll never forget. You showed me that there are many different ways to experience music, many different ways to be in the world, and that different doesn't mean wrong, it means special, it means valuable, it means bringing something unique and important that the world needs." Max looked directly at Blake, making eye contact that felt comfortable rather than forced. "Will you remember that the numbers can dance?" he asked, his voice clearer now that his anxiety had decreased. "Will you tell other people that different music is still good music?" "I'll remember that forever," Blake promised, his voice thick with emotion. "And I want you to remember that your voice, your heart, your unique way of seeing the world, and even the numbers in your head are all gifts that make the world more beautiful and more interesting." Sarah, Max's mother, approached the stage with tears streaming down her face. "Blake, thank you for seeing my son for who he truly is, for understanding that his autism doesn't define his limitations. It defines his unique strength and perspectives. You just gave him something that many adults with autism never receive: complete acceptance and genuine curiosity about his inner experience." The segment became one of the Voice's most meaningful moments, shared widely not just for its entertainment value, but for its powerful message about acceptance, understanding, and the beauty of neurodiversity. Autism advocacy organizations used the clip in awareness campaigns, music therapists incorporated it into training materials, and educators shared it as an example of inclusive practices that benefit everyone. Blake learned something that day that changed his approach to working with all young performers. "Max taught me that the most important thing we can do as adults is meet children where they are, understand their unique needs, and help them shine in their own way, rather than trying to make them fit into our preconceived expectations. Because sometimes the most powerful performances come from voices that experience the world differently. Sometimes the most beautiful connections happen when we stop trying to change people and start trying to understand them. And sometimes a 10-year-old boy who rocks to calm his mind can teach an entire television studio that different doesn't mean wrong. It means wonderfully, beautifully, uniquely human."